Good morning. The people's testimony today is from Bayard Rustin, who's a civil rights and LGBTQ plus rights activist, and it's a long one. We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. I'll say it again. We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. The testimony this morning is from Ruth, chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman." Amen.
Thank you, Blair. Ruth is a scandalous book. Don't let the seemingly innocuous name fool you. All right, for those of you just joining us, maybe you've missed the first couple of weeks that we were doing the book of Ruth. I'll try to catch you up to speed. First, we had these two women over in the land of Moab, which is a neighboring country to Israel. Naomi, who was an Israelite, had moved over there with her husband and her two kids, two sons, and they came over there 10 years earlier because of a famine. What do we do when our agriculture is affected by a changing climate? We've always moved, right? Folks act like this is a new thing. It's not. Many of us here today would not be here if it wasn't for some famine or another that affected our ancestors, right? So, while there, life happens, and so does death. Naomi's whole family eventually dies, leaving her alone with two daughter-in-laws who are quite young and ready to move on with their lives. At least they could. They have that capacity to remarry, which Naomi encourages them to do. But she sees no prospects in Moab, and she starts heading back to Bethlehem, the city that she's from, and Ruth insists on coming with her, in spite of the fact that she herself has no prospects in Israel, despite the fact that she herself is a part of a maligned group of people that Israelites are not supposed to associate with, let alone marry. But she will not let Naomi struggle to scratch up a living on her own. So they go over to Bethlehem. Ruth starts gleaning the fields, which is just an old-timey word. It means like picking up the grain that is left behind. And the gentleman who owns the field that she's at takes notice. The whole town, don't be too impressed, it's like 250, maybe 400 people. They know about this stranger who's not an Israelite, who's come into town to take care of Naomi. He sees her, learns from one of his head harvesters that she's been working her tail off, taking care of Naomi. And so this gentleman, Boaz, goes to her, gives her lots of food, treats her quite hospitably, and then tells her, keep cleaning my fields. But you really should do so with the women who clean the fields, because I don't really think you should be with these guys so much. He doesn't say it, but it's pretty implicit. I want you with the women because I don't trust these guys to do right by you. Now, we fast forward 2 months later, and the season of harvesting is over, which means the season of threshing is beginning. But during those 2 months, Ruth collects enough grain for her and Naomi to last them the whole year, for the next 10 months. And that's incredible. Thank you, Boaz. But here's the issue. Charity only gets us so far. Charity doesn't solve this problem for them. They need a situational change. And that issue continues to be the problem for us today as well. Charity only gets us so far. As long as people are dependent on charity, they're dependent on changing whims. They're dependent on whether or not there is a famine in the lands, or as we might think of it, whether or not the market is doing well, right? As long as people are dependent on charity, you can predict that devastation is going to come at some points. Maybe the morale of our town, our state, our business, our country, maybe it's just not doing well enough for us to keep up this charitable giving. And what do you do in a year where you have 8% inflation on many of our products? I am talking about today. I don't want to project that back in there. It's not like they had to worry about inflation too much, but as many of us are not gleaning fields, I think it's important to point out. Doesn't that affect our charitable giving? This is why we advocate for systemic changes in our world. This is why when, just a few weeks ago, our asylum-seeking neighbors were needing a place to stay, we weren't content to just try to find a house or two for them to stay in, right? Actually, turns out those were pretty hard to find. No, we advocated for our county to make a change to their budget. And I won't act like that is the end-all be-all. It's certainly not. But it is a significant change for this next year for our asylum-seeking neighbors. Now, ancient Jewish culture was not supposed to be a system where people fell through the cracks. It's just we aren't super comfortable with the safety nets they had in place. I will point out what they were because they kind of matter in the story. One is begging. It was just accepted that some folks were going to have to ask for alms, and it was a part of their religious practice to graciously give what you could. Not a super comfortable plan. That's why Ruth came with Naomi. I don't want you just dependent on collecting alms. Another is the gleaning. And then there's another safety net, one that I've mentioned before, but it's important to bring up here, and it's specific for women. And that is marriage. This is a world where women could not earn their own living. They couldn't have a job. They couldn't own a field. At best, they could maybe steward a field until their child came of age. And if that child is a male, they could inherit it. But here's where the safety net comes in. If their partner dies, they're supposed to be able to connect to the next male family member so that they're not destitute and their children are not destitute. This is why polygamy was a thing in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't just because you have quirky folks like Solomon who decide they want 1,000 partners. 1,000, maybe pushing it, I think. Just throwing that out there. It was supposed to be a way to try to keep people from dying in this patriarchal, male-driven world. It was also a means for transferring property. And it was also the retirement plan. What happens when you're older? Well, there's not a retirement home. Your kids and your grandkids, they're supposed to be taking care of you. So you can see the gravity that Ruth feels when Naomi starts heading back, right? And you can see why Naomi called herself bitter, and now, at this point in our story, starts changing her tune. She's not thinking of herself just as bitter anymore. She's actually quite grateful for Ruth. And she prays in the chapter before that Ruth be provided for. And this is one of the interesting things in the book of Ruth for me. Whenever a character prays, there's an action that follows it. None of our characters show up and just pray. They pray and they act. I think that should be instructive for us. So Naomi proposes to Ruth a special plan. We got to change this situation. We can't do this forever. What if you went to Boaz, our kinsman redeemer, that means like somebody who's supposed to be near next in line, to take on Ruth since her husband died? What if Boaz could be that person? He already seems to like you. He respects you. But how are you going to do this? Now, they could just wait for Boaz to come to her. But we get no indication that Boaz is ever going to do that. So, Naomi says, Ruth, here's the plan. I want you to go over to the threshing floor, the structure that Boaz has for threshing. And I want you to spy on him. And I want you to wait until he eats and drinks and then goes to lay down for the night. And then you go to him, uncover his feet, and wait for him to tell you what to do next. This is some plan. I'm a little uncomfortable with it. Ruth says, okay, let's do it. Let's give this a shot. Now, if you're thinking, uncovering the feet, that sounds a little intimate. It may be more than you think. Often in Scripture, in the Hebrew Bible, uncovering the feet is used euphemistically for, I'm trying to think of like a nice churchy way to put it. Everybody's wearing robes, right? So if you're going to go use the facility, what do you have to do? You have to uncover your feet. And if you're going to get intimate, what are you going to do? You're going to uncover your feet. I've called this episode Bold Scandal for a reason. Many a Christian who may be more prudishly aligned, I find myself often over there. Not that I want to be, it's just how I was brought up, and I get, I blush easy, has felt uncomfortable with this chapter. But Naomi and Ruth know that they've got to take some drastic action to change their situation. So Ruth gets herself nice and cleaned up, This is going to be the first time that Boaz ever encounters her, not covered in sweat and grime and chaff. And she puts on a nice, clean garment. This is the ancient world. I'm sure this is simply garment number 2 or 3 in the rotation, because they don't have many of them, right? And she watches him from afar, and she waits for him to eat and drink and go to lay down. Now, this is a dangerous plan, right? What if this is what Boaz has been waiting for this whole time? What if Boaz has simply just been wanting to have a roll in the hay with Ruth, and so he's being extra kind? What if he casts her away afterwards because he got what he wanted? What if Boaz takes Deuteronomy 23 seriously, which forbids marrying Moabite women? What if he takes Deuteronomy 27 seriously, which says that anybody who violates these teachings will be cursed? There's a lot at risk here. This isn't just a simple act of seduction. This is a supremely brave act. And it's one filled with hope and faith. And I think it's not just faith in God. I think it's faith in this man who's shown kindness as he can. She goes, she spies on him, she waits for the right moment. The candle or the lamp dims. It's dark. She goes and uncovers his feet. And you know what happens? Nothing. The poor guy is sound asleep. And so Ruth too goes to sleep. I mean, the plan was for her to wait for him to tell her what to do next. And the very next words we hear from Boaz are shrieks of terror when he wakes up in the middle of the night and realizes there is a person at his feet. And so Ruth too wakes up and she explains the situation. And then she does something that goes beyond Naomi's suggestion, because Boaz is not telling her a single thing. She proposes to him. Boaz, can you put your cloak of protection over me? This is a euphemism for marriage. But it's also a callback to Boaz's prayer, the chapter before, when he prayed that God would put God's cloak of protection around Ruth. Boaz is touched. He is an older man. And he's so humbled that Ruth, this woman of remarkable character, has come to him. He says, you could have gone after younger men, whether they be poor or rich. You could have found somebody else who would have been interested in you, but you came to me. And he recognizes that she came to him not just because of him, but because she wants to do right by her dead relatives, her dead husbands. She wants to provide a legacy. He thinks that's rather remarkable. And he also sees the connection to Naomi. She's trying to do right by Naomi too. And so he says, I sure hope that we can do this. That sounds awesome to me. But as all good romantic comedies have, 3/4 into our story, we learn that there is a wrench in the works. Turns out that there is a guy more closely related to her deceased husband than he is. And he wants to do right by the law even though this is a time when many people do not care. It's the time of the judges, where everybody's, we're told, immensely individualistic and ego-driven. He wants to do right. And he asks that person. He says, do you want to marry Ruth? But that is a story for another day. Here's part of why I love this so much. Sometimes doing the right thing is scandalous. Often doing the right thing is terrifying. It's an act of faith and courage and justice. We do not know how other people will respond. When we talk about the historical accomplishments of justice and equity for marginalized people, we usually highlight the achievements of powerful people on their behalf. When we talk about slavery ending, we focus on Lincoln, forgetting that African American people had been fighting for their freedom and their survival since the very first ship pulled in, right? I want to point that one out in particular because Juneteenth is coming up this week, right? For most of our history, white people here were largely indifferent to black slaves. Now, the suffragettes as well, they fought to open up the eyes of our country. And if they had waited for the men to come around to seeing them as rightful citizens, do you think it would have happened? I don't think so either. If the civil rights movement had waited for white people as a whole to come around to the unfair treatment of BIPOC people, I'm convinced that not a single piece of legislation would have passed. And if LGBTQIA plus people would have waited for straight cisgender people to come around to recognizing them as valid and worthwhile as they are, deserving of love and respect, then our government would still be imprisoning, castrating, sometimes murdering them. There would be no hate crime laws, no legal protection from discrimination or abuse. And if workers had never formed unions, instead of waiting for employers to care about their safety needs, or adequate pay, or job security, then inequity and exploitation would be an even bigger problem than we have today. But I want to point out that each one of these wins that we celebrate were scandalous. And sadly, for some of us, are still scandalous. So much so that many in our government and in the law sectors and business sectors are attempting to unwind them, right? I used to think these things were done, because I learned about them in school or saw them happening when I was in my early adulthood. They're not done. So here is my prayerful hope from this story, that we continue to listen to those in our community and beyond who experience marginalization in some way, shape, or form, those who are othered and crushed in society. And I recognize that many of us in this room fall into some category of othering. Even ageism is a form of othering. Don't let the jokes that people crack at your expense distract you from the fact that it's an othering. we need to still listen. And we need to still follow where God is leading us into the world that God desires. We can't simply be dependent on the kind, gracious, compassionate whims of ourselves or one another or our neighbors or the government. We have to keep working for systemic change and celebrate when we see it happening.